Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. From FingerLakes1.com, this is FLX Today. I'm joined by National Right to Work Foundation President Mark Mix to talk about unions and Starbucks as the coffee chain makes local headlines stemming from its closure of 2 Ithaca locations. Mark, thanks so much for taking the time today. First things first, could you give us some background on the foundation?
Yeah, the National Right to Work Foundation has been around since 1968. And its primary mission is to help employees in their ability to access their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. Going back to the 1930s, the federal government imposed labor policy on the entire country for private sector workers. And so since then, workers have been battling to exercise their rights under Section 7 of the law, which says workers have the right to join together for mutual aid and benefit, to bargain. And it also says has the right to refrain. And unfortunately, it's that last stroke of Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act that is kind of the mission statement for the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. We are helping employees in their right to refrain. The law allows union officials to basically require them to join and associate with the union as a condition of their employment. And so since 1968, our now 20 staff attorneys have litigated 18 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. We have over 250 active cases at any given time over a 12-month period. And literally all of these cases are on behalf of an employee trying to exercise their rights. We sue unions and companies. Businesses who violate workers' rights are just as susceptible to charges from workers as unions. It turns out that most folks coming to us are actually in union situations and compulsory situations where they want to try to exercise their rights. And so the foundation has been doing that for many, many, many years and had great success, although on a limited basis, because we're up against a pretty big operation when it comes to organized labor across the country.
Of course. And you personally, when did you get involved with the foundation?
Yeah. Amazingly enough, I've been doing this for 36 years. I started out traveling the country, working for individuals across the country. I actually grew up in a little town south of Rochester, New York called Alfred. And there, my stepfather was a 32-year member of the Machinist Union, worked at Foster Wheeler Company in Dansville, New York. 1976, I walked a picket line there with him. And it's kind of an interesting story as it comes roundabout. But it's one that has become a passion for me in that our ability to help individual employees exercise their rights. And it's been very rewarding in the context of seeing workers who have the courage to stand up and say, you know what, I don't think this is right. And being able to provide free legal aid to those workers has been really a wonderful thing and a wonderful experience for the last 36 years.
And obviously, the context for this situation is what we've seen unfolding regionally, and then, of course, across the country with Starbucks. 2 Ithaca locations have recently closed. The company closed 2 locations in Ithaca. There's been ongoing unionization efforts in Rochester, Buffalo, kind of the across the whole span. I'm curious where the foundation kind of enters this equation and where the foundation is in context of Starbucks and employees, workers. Right now in this moment, because this has kind of been going on for a few years now, but I think for a lot of folks, especially here in the Finger Lakes, they haven't probably heard too much about this until like, say, maybe the last 6 to 12-ish months. So where are you guys in context of the Starbucks situation?
Yeah. It's interesting. You know, Rochester and Buffalo were kind of ground zero for Starbucks organizing. And it turns out that we found out that the Service Employees International Union, which is kind of the back office of the Workers United Union, that is the front-facing union at the Starbucks locations across the country, the SEIU spent $2.5 million paying their employees to go into Starbucks. One in Buffalo, I think it was a 24-year-old Rhodes Scholar who was paid $50,000 a year to go into the Starbucks, get a job there, basically get himself into the place and then agitate for unionization. We found out that a young lady who testified at a congressional hearing recently represented herself as a Workers United Starbucks employee when in fact she was a SEIU employee as well. They were salting. That's a pretty common practice by unions. So what started in Buffalo and Rochester has kind of worked its way across the country, primarily on the West Coast in Seattle and Portland and other places. But here are the facts. There are 15,900 Starbucks stores across the country. There are 9,200, over 9,200 company stores. The union up to this point, as far as we can tell, through the end of May, has won 315 elections. They've lost something like 73. And there's been 33 or 34 where they've withdrawn because they knew they weren't going to get the vote. So we're talking about a relatively small percentage of the stores, but it's been getting big press. I mean, it's really interesting how this has become a national news story. And frankly, from the Rochester Buffalo standpoint, where it was a starting point, we got involved when employees started to call us, Josh, because after union workers are basically bound to the union for at least a year after a vote has been certified. They have to wait a year before they can kind of think about what the next step would be. That year is coming due in a lot of the early stores that Starbucks, the union organized. For example, in Buffalo and Rochester, where there are decertifications, I think in one store in Rochester, one store in Buffalo. And then we're representing employees of what's called a reserve roastery in Manhattan. They called us and said, hey, what are our rights? How do we work this? The union's not really speaking for us. We don't know what they're doing. Their views are a little different than ours. What's our next step? And so we're helping those individuals walk through what is known as a decertification process. And that is a vote to remove the union from the workplace. And so we're starting to get calls from across the country from Starbucks workers that are saying, nothing's been happening. And obviously there's lots of reasons. Workers United has a reason for that. Starbucks has a reason for that. But our interest is not necessarily either Workers United or Starbucks. It's the employees that we want to help exercise their rights. So they're calling us now, and that 1 year period is beginning to expire for a lot of these stores. And under current NLRB, National Labor Relations Board regulations, you can't try to decertify a union for at least 12 months after the union's certified. That window is becoming open, and now workers are starting to call the foundation.
I'm curious because anytime we've seen this play out before, right? Like we've seen folks who work in different unions here in the Finger Lakes quietly voice their displeasure with what their union has decided to do, whether it be a strike or a contract agreement or whatever the case may be. Where is the balance? When you look at like these types of issues, you guys are probably analyzing these on a pretty regular basis. Where is the balance in either the framework on the legal side or just in terms of kind of real world implementation of unionizing or maintaining a union so that all parties can have that sort of independent choice and autonomy, the things that you guys end up, I guess, fighting for on behalf of a lot of these people who, sometimes want out?
Yeah, Josh, that's a great question. And it's a really simple answer. Unfortunately, because of the money that's involved and the political power that's involved, sometimes it gets obscured. Here's the solution. We have a one-page bill, literally a one-page bill that's currently pending in the United States Congress right now called the National Right to Work Act. And it doesn't add a single word to federal law. It simply goes into that 1935 law that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1937. And it says the bias in labor policy will be in favor of voluntarism, not compulsion. The way the law is written today is if the union can get a simple majority of those voting in a workplace, they get the control over every worker in that workplace. And in states that don't have right to work laws, currently 27 states have right to work laws where you can't be compelled to pay dues or fees in order to keep your job. But in 23 states like New York, if you don't pay union dues or fees, you lose your job. We believe in voluntary unionism. In fact, Samuel Gompers, the founder of the American Federation of Labor, in his final speech to union delegates in El Paso, Texas in 1924 said this. He said, I urge the devotion of voluntarism because anything that tries to force workers will destroy an organization that's brought together through voluntarism that is inherently stronger than anything that can be cobbled together through force. Unfortunately, union officials starting going back to 1926 with the Railway Labor Act, the 1933 with the Industrial Recovery Act, which was struck down by the Supreme Court, 1935, the Wagner Act that was upheld, unfortunately, by the U.S. Supreme Court when they got pressured by Franklin Roosevelt to pack the court with 6 new justices. Since that time, federal labor policy's default is in favor of compulsion and force. If the union officials would just give up compulsion and force and then not be so reliant on politics, whether it be in Albany or Washington, D.C., they would be a lot stronger organization representing those workers that truly want their representation. What they say is that workers aren't smart enough to figure this out on their own. I don't believe that. 94% of private sector workers in America are not part of unions. They do get paid. They do get benefits. They do get vacation time. They do have happy lives. Some of them maybe not. They maybe question that today or tomorrow or this morning as they drive to work. But the bottom line is this: voluntary unionism will work well for organized labor. They just won't embrace it. They want to rely on government power, and that's why they have to play politics, whether it be in the Empire State or the United States. They have to play politics. They spend a lot of money to protect that privilege.
I am curious, when you're looking at a situation like the Starbucks situation, how long do these typically take to get from start to resolution? And what does resolution look like? I mean, you guys, dozens and dozens of cases at any given time. What does resolution look like in some of these cases?
Yeah, well, let's take Starbucks, for example, since that's what we're talking about. So what happens first is and it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, they hire someone to go in and agitate, and that person's responsibility is to get at least 30% of the bargaining unit to sign a petition saying they would like to have a union election. So let's say there are, I'm a government school graduate, Josh, so I'll make the math really easy. So let's say there are 10 people in the bargaining unit. They have to get 4 people to sign the petition. That petition is sent to a regional office of the National Labor Relations Board. The regional director looks at it and says, okay, I believe this is an adequate representation of that workforce, and so we will conduct an election. Generally, the rules say the best way to do that is through a secret ballot where we get to write our preference on a piece of paper and put it in a box so no one else knows. Union officials are kind of relying on mail ballot elections and other means now because secret ballots are not open enough for them to decide who's with them and who's against them. So they like mail balloting. They want to try it with electric balloting, electronic balloting, internet balloting, all kinds of other ideas. So in the simplest form, it would be a secret ballot election. The NLRB representative would count the votes. And in our situation, if let's say that 5 people voted and 3 people voted for the union, those 3 have now bound all 10 workers to a union negotiation. That negotiation will start. They will try to bargain a contract, and that can take that. Well, let me say this. The election usually takes anywhere from maybe 3 weeks to 4 weeks to be conducted. Union officials want to compress that because they know that as people learn more about a union and it becomes a high profile issue, they start to lose votes. So that's a first kind of starting point. So then we get to the bargaining session, and the requirements under the law says that both parties must bargain in good faith. Now, what good faith is subject to how a bureaucrat looks at it and what's happened in the bargaining spot. In the Starbucks case, what's happened there is the union is dead set on negotiating contracts over Zoom. They want to do it publicly like we're doing right now, and someone can be recording this. In fact, I got a little message that says we're recording, so I know we're live and this can go out anywhere and people can have that. The law prefers one-on-one in-person bargaining as the process for that. Now, obviously, what one party demands, the other party may resist. What the other party demands, the other party may resist. So you have this back and forth of bargaining. As long as it remains in good faith, and as long as the parties make sure they're bargaining over mandatory subjects of bargaining, then that process can go on for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, even longer in this case. And I know there's real questions about how Starbucks is coming to the table. There's a dispute between the two parties here. The union says we've demanded negotiations. Starbucks says we've demanded negotiations, and yet not many negotiations are taking place at this time. I think there's 62 or 63 contracts that are in process where they're negotiating. Some of them, they still haven't set the ground rules for what happens. So once they get the contract, then that contract will either be probably a minimum of 3 years, maybe a max of 5 years. But once that contract's negotiated, those workers are bound by that contract for the next 3 years. And Josh, that's been one of the interesting developments of this, is that Starbucks has offered raises and paid raises to a lot of baristas over the course of the last 2 years. But if you're in a union negotiation, it's an unfair labor practice charge for Starbucks to pay those employees that have been unionized additional wages. So these baristas are saying, why don't we get a pay raise? Well, the answer is because the union will file a ULP against the employer, Starbucks in this case, if they give them additional money during negotiations or prior to an election. So it's really kind of harmed a lot of workers out there that they've been in these negotiations or been in the election process because they haven't been able to get a raise. I'm not, from our standpoint, our job is to represent employees. So I'm not sure I have a dog in either side of this fight. What I do have a dog in, what we have a dog in, is helping employees exercise their rights, whether it be to get in or get out or whatever it is. So this 3-year contract's imposed. Then at that point, the workers cannot get out. They cannot decertify the union under a regulation called the contract bar for up to 3 years. So that contract will be in place for 3 years. There'll be obviously grievances filed. There'll be things that happen in the workplace that will be adjudicated by the contract. But at that point, at the end of 3 years, workers can petition to redo a contract or vote for a new contract, or they can try to exercise their rights for decertification. That's a real simple labor law primer for you, maybe more than you bargained for, no pun intended.
That'll do it for this edition of Finger Lakes Today. If you'd like to see more conversations like this one, check out the show on your favorite podcast platform or subscribe to the FingerLakes1.com YouTube channel. Have a great day, and we will see you next time.